do that to understand what's going on with Leviticus and the purity laws, but tonight I want to keep a bigger picture in mind, move through the story, and we got to start with the transition from Tabernacle to the Temple of Solomon, but we're really just going to touch down on that and mention a couple things, and then we'll get to the New Testament. So let's pray before we start. Lord, thank you for the evening to gather, to look at your word, to try to learn more about you and our place and our role in your church, how this all applies to us, how we can draw closer to Jesus and each other, and be your witnesses on earth with the information you give us here tonight. So by your Spirit, will you show us things we can make use of to edify and evangelize others and to be good representatives of you. Meet us in your glory, we pray, in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so there's just kind of a sketch of Solomon's temple. We're going to come back to Leviticus in a moment, but essentially the tabernacle is built, and then it's a sort of formative institution for Israel. That is, it's meant to be something that forms them into a representative people of God as they are not in the place they were sort of destined or determined that they should be, right? The Passover takes them out of Egypt. The experience on Mount Sinai is in itself a formative experience. It forms them essentially as a nation, as a people bound by covenant to Yahweh. The tabernacle was supposed to continue or perpetuate or replay that Sinai experience, in a sense, Sabbath to Sabbath, by way of entry into the tabernacle, mediated by the priests and through the offerings. They could replay the experience, that formative experience of Sinai. So I mentioned this before. I think it's helpful to think of it as like a wedding ceremony on Mount Sinai, and then the ongoing intimacy of God, of Yahweh with his bride in the wilderness. Now the wilderness tent is not the goal. That's not where you want to take your bride to live forever. It's a concession. It's an accommodation. It's God in his grace saying, yeah, this is the wilderness, but I've got a place for you. Not yet, but we'll get there, right? The promised land is obviously the goal. A fixed place where Yahweh can dwell with them in a more permanent way, in a more permanent sense, was the goal. So the tabernacle is this formative experience in an ongoing relationship with Yahweh, but it was never meant to be the place they ended up. It wasn't meant to be permanent. So that leads to an interesting transition when you finally get to King David. And there's a good deal we are going to just skip over because, from Leviticus and then Numbers and Deuteronomy, when they're about to go into the land, and then, upon entering in, Moses dies, Joshua takes his place. You have the whole book of Joshua, and then leading into Judges, like the period of the Judges. What's happening at the tabernacle doesn't turn out to be very great, right? By the time you get to Samuel and then King David eventually, Samuel has a mess on his hands. The tabernacle has been corrupted, right? By the time Samuel comes on the scene, Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they've really corrupted it. So it's not as if when we leave off the tabernacle and say skip over to the King Solomon's temple, it's been a delightful honeymoon period that whole time. It's interesting because that's how actually God will refer to that period in Jeremiah. But if you look at it, it's like this turns into a mess like everything else that was supposed to be formative for Israel. They were supposed to, through the experience of the tabernacle, they were supposed to become better representatives of God. They were supposed to replay the Garden of Eden, be the new humanity that represents God to the rest of the nations. Well, as always, it doesn't really always work out that way. So there's a lot of interesting things we will skip over. But in any case, that you do get to a point where King David will desire to build a house for God. David will not be the one to build it, but essentially the plans come to and through David, and then Solomon, his son, will build it. We'll get to that in a moment. And then here's a sort of simple sketch of the Solomon's holy temple. Here's a sort of cutaway version of it. I don't know if the lighting works from where you guys are, so that you can see inside. And all these are kind of rough estimates. The accuracy of some of these are hard to tell, but one thing that becomes very obvious is it becomes massively expanded. From the size of the tabernacle to the size of the temple alone, it's just a huge, huge augmentation. It's massive. And everything gets enhanced and elevated. So the gold is just everywhere. Instead of one little bronze laver out front for the priest to wash, there's a whole bunch of them lining this. You can see over here on what is essentially the south side. The cherubim covering the ark are huge. It's thought by some scholars that the actual tent, the wilderness tent, goes inside the temple, and they just sort of place it there. The temple sort of subsumes the tabernacle, and that's possible. Actually, some interesting reasons that people read it that way, and it certainly could fit in there. It was a huge, huge structure. Instead of one menorah, the candlestick that's shown on the bread of the presence, there's like 10 of them or something. It's just a massive, massive undertaking. Not without its problems theologically, too, when we get to. I'm going to skip over all this, so I'll just mention it to you. When Solomon builds the temple, as it's described in the text, some of it seems like, great, this is obviously what we want. A new house where Yahweh will dwell with us. And he desires it. But there's some ambiguity to it in that Solomon, first of all, he conscripts slave labor to help build it, and that doesn't seem like a great thing to do. All these other little hints in the text that he's doing this both as the sort of messianic figure who will build God's house and bring peace to the nation. That's what his name means, Shlomo, the one who brings peace. He's like the man of peace. But also, there's the steps going up are like, it's one of the places in the Bible, one of the clearest places in the Bible where the steps to Solomon going up to the temple are 666. The talents of gold that it's made with 666 talents of gold. You have I think it's 18 steps going up, which is a multiple of 6, 6, and 6. It's really bizarre and interesting and sort of almost cryptic in the way it presents Solomon as both a sort of Messiah figure, but also a bit of an Antichrist figure, like he is both. Anyway, the splendor of the temple that Solomon builds is a double-edged sword, and we'll come back to that. Too much to go into now. Here's David's 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 5. Here's where David is, concocting this idea. He's brought the ark. The ark has been resting. The tabernacle has been at a place called Shiloh, and there it has rested. And David's got now security, sort of peace from his enemies, and he starts sort of contemplating the idea, why don't I build a house for the Lord? Why should I have a house of cedar and Yahweh dwells in a tent? And here's God's response to him in verse 5. Go tell my servant David, this is to the prophet Nathan, I think. Thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. But I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all the places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? And then skipping a little bit ahead down to verse 10. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. This is the promise to bring them into the land securely. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly. From the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. So this is Yahweh's reply to David's desire to build Yahweh a house. This is really important. The whole covenant with David centers on this, and there's a fascinating little turnabout here. When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So David wants to build the house for Yahweh. Yahweh won't let him do it. He's a man of blood, he says. Interesting, given the defilement themes of how the actual tabernacle worked. It's almost as if David brings too much blood to the table to be a man associated with the new house of God. I'm not certain of that. It just sort of pops into my head occasionally when I think about why couldn't David? Well, he's a man of war. He's a military commander. But okay, he's not going to be able to do it. So it seems like a sort of rebuff to David. However, he still honors David in this setup, right? This whole response is still, in a way, honoring David. The way that he does this is actually really clever. And there's a profound sort of covenant reality happening here that will endure, as we'll get to in the New Testament. But it takes place via a very sophisticated, I mean, it's pretty simple, I guess, not that sophisticated, but a very rich wordplay in Hebrew. I'll just put a little tally of it up here so you can kind of see how it works. So David wants to build Yahweh a house. House is bait. You say a bait in Hebrew. The way you say to build is bana. The verb to build is a bana. So you build a bait, you bana a bait with stones, which is, the Hebrew word for stone is even. So you would bana a bait through evanim, stones. God's answer to David is that, no, I'm going to bana you a bait. And house can also mean a household, right? So I can say, you can refer to a house as the building your family lives in, or your family. It can be your household is also your bait. The way you say to build a family, or the way you build a family in sort of ancient Hebrew thought, you bana a household, a bait, through benim, sons. The word for son is a ben, which is basically identical to the word for stone, even, with one consonant added at the beginning. So there seems to be this very intricate, but pretty obvious in Hebrew wordplay. Yahweh is going to build a house for David, reversing the trend that David thought would happen, which is, I will build a house for Yahweh. What would David's house be made of? Well, it would be made of evanim. What will Yahweh build David's house with? Benim, or ben, a son. And it sort of starts to work on multiple levels. Solomon will be the one to build the actual bait of God, the house of God, with stones. But the promise Yahweh gives David seems to be much more focused on the fact that, David, I will build you a household, meaning through your descendants will the kings of Israel always give the people security, right? What does a house do? It's a place to dwell securely. That's kind of the idea here. So he's promised a dynasty to David. It would always be David's sons, benim, who rule on the throne. That is the household God promises to David, and it will endure forever. And it's a really clever little way of honoring David, even while he's saying, you're not going to build me the house. Your son will build me a house, but through your son, I will build you a house. Is that, it's like a Three Stooges bit? Or does that make sense? You with me? All right, it's there in the text, and this becomes the Davidic covenant, anchored here in this idea of the house, the household, the stones that are sort of, instead of stones, how about we use people? Right? How about we use sons, benim, instead of evanim, stones? Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it later. At the very end of Leviticus, you have this whole chapter 26 lists out the necessity of keeping the Sabbaths, honoring the Sabbaths, that is the weekly Sabbath, but also the land Sabbath every 7 years, and then the Jubilee every 50 years. These are all delineated in chapters 23 through 25 of Leviticus. Chapter 26 says, you better keep all these and reverence my sanctuary, which is what the previous chapters of Leviticus were almost all about, for I am Yahweh. And then he lays out a whole bunch of things that if you walk in my statutes and observe, here are all the blessings that will follow. If you fail to do these things, if you rebel, if you are unfaithful and you turn against me, here are all the curses. Here are all the consequences that will result. So as he lays this out at the end of Leviticus, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their seasons, and the land shall yield its increase. Again, this has the land in mind. When they're going to permanently position themselves in the promised land, this has this in mind. The trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last to the time of the grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall last to the time for sowing. You shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land securely. Verse 9, I will turn to you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and will confirm my covenant with you. Now that fruitful and multiply language is directly from Genesis 1, right? Remember, this all goes back, the tabernacle reality all goes back to the creation reality. The calling of humanity from creation is to serve God in his temple as his priestly representatives. And part of that, like the Levitical language there is to observe and to guard, or to serve and to guard, or work and keep, or something like that. But it's Levitical language. But you also get this language of, I will make you fruitful and multiply, which harkens back to Genesis as well. You shall eat old store long kept, and you shall clear out the old and make way for the new. I will make my mishkan among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. That particular phrase, verbal form of walk, hithalek, is something like, is also a direct echo of Genesis 3, back to the garden. It's more like, I will walk around among you, right? It's not just a simple way of saying walk from here to there. It's a way of saying, as God did in the garden with Adam and Eve, he will walk among them, right? It seems a very direct reference to Genesis and the garden, highlighting the idea that the purpose of the tabernacle, if they would obey the covenant and honor this sanctuary, and Sabbath to Sabbath, keep the Sabbaths and honor the sanctuary as it was all laid out in Leviticus, that this covenant reality that God would grant them would be this restoration of Eden blessing. Fruitful, multiply, and I will walk around in your midst. It's a beautiful thing. I have a whole teaching on this, but just hitting the highlights here. It's a really powerful expression. And in the context turns out to be a really dire warning, because you kind of know when you're reading Leviticus 26, the direction it's going to go, right? Because you read the rest of the Bible. And you know the covenant they are not going to keep. But the reality that's promised by God in this section is more than just, when you get to the land, things will go well, the land will produce. It really is I will restore Eden for you as God's Eden people, right? It's something just about that rich and deep as it's intended. It's something like, when you get there to the place I'm sending you, it will be a new world reborn. Does that make sense? Right? That may be overstating it a little bit, but I think that's the intent. Because it never actually happens, we don't get to the intent. But again, lock that away. When we get to the New Testament, I think we start to see these realities emerge. This is also something like what Ezekiel promised, what Yahweh promised through Ezekiel. I will make a covenant of peace with them. This is in chapter 37 of Ezekiel, in this sort of eschatological restoration. And a lot of the prophets pick up this type of language when they speak about Israel's restoration from exile. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will set them in their land and multiply them, and I will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. Remember, this is in the exile, after both sanctuary and temple have been eliminated. They're no more. And the people have been quite a long time now, or some time anyway, without God's presence in their midst. We'll just show you a reference here.
Mosaic?
I will make a covenant of peace with them. In Ezekiel's Ezekiel is using the language of new covenant. Since they broke the covenant of Moses, Ezekiel speaks, as Jeremiah does, of a new covenant. and this everlasting covenant that will bring about a renewal, a restoration. So this, I think, would be in context the new covenant, what we would think of as what Hebrews and the New Testament would talk about as the new covenant. But included in this is the idea of also God will dwell with them. So there's no dwelling place. He's not there anymore, as we'll see, as we've already seen in Ezekiel. But when he makes his sanctuary in their midst, when his dwelling place is with them, and he is their God and they are his people, then the nations, in verse 28, will know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forevermore. So this is not just the point here is not just to restore Israel with this new tabernacle reality where God dwells in their midst, this new covenant. It is to be again a witness for the nations. They will know I'm the God who makes Israel holy. And then the idea there, and this you go back to Isaiah for this as well, is the nations are supposed to be attracted to that they would come to Jerusalem. They would want to go up to that holy mountain and ascend into God's presence, into the temple, and be where he is, and join Israel in covenant. That's the idea in Isaiah especially. That's, I think, what's active here in Ezekiel. This is especially important given the way the book of Ezekiel starts. Right? At the very opening of Ezekiel, chapter 1, Ezekiel is in exile. He's in Babylon, and he sees this. It's a little hard to explain, especially because you got like nut jobs on TV talking about how it's certainly an alien, like it's a UFO of some sort, and the best explanation there is like aliens. Ezekiel sees this. He can't even describe it. He has always all these qualifying adverbs that sort of can't describe directly what he's seeing, but there's a rainbow and these living beings and these wheels that turn within wheels, and it's a very mysterious thing, and there's something like the image of the glory of God there. And essentially, let me sum it up for you. What he sees in exile in Babylon at the start of his prophecy in chapter 1 is what scholars refer to as a divine chariot throne. Okay, it is a movable throne. When kings go out to battle, they're still kings, right? They still have to be conveyed on some glorious conveyance, right? They have to. So kings would have this, what do we call it? A palanquin. You'd carry this thing around, or it'd be carried around, and the king would sit on it. This is a divine chariot. In other words, it's mobile. But it is a throne, so it expresses that he's ruling from this seat. It's conveyed by cherubim, because cherubim, these angelic divine beings, are always throne room guardians. Back to Genesis, back to the tabernacle where they're embroidered on the tent, on the curtain, right? Ezekiel sees this vision and it's like, what's the point of this? The point is that the temple is, depending on how you date Ezekiel, either about to or has already been destroyed. Right? There is no place. Oh no. Well, Ezekiel sees a vision of he's been removed from from Jerusalem. He's in Babylon. The temple in chapter 10 is still standing, but it has been so badly polluted by the abominations that the priesthood and the leadership of Israel at Jerusalem have defiled it with all these abominations. There's idols in there, they're worshiping the sun god, etc. That at that stage, Yahweh's glory just elevates, packs up, and leaves the temple. And Ezekiel sees a vision of this in chapter 10. Back in chapter 1, that's sort of a matching experience. The point is, he sees God's glory in Babylon. God gives him a vision of, hey, I am still ruling on the throne. It's just that I've moved. Right? It's a relocation for all intents and purposes. But it's meant to give Ezekiel and the people he's going to prophesy to encouragement. Yes, you're in exile. No, Babylon's not where you're supposed to be. But don't worry, you wouldn't want to be in Jerusalem anyway, because that place is about to go down. That temple is about to be destroyed. So, best hope you can take is to take heart. Yahweh still rules on the throne. He just doesn't have to be located in one place anymore. He never had to be located in one place. The fact that he chose to be was always a concession by his grace that he would choose to be. And in both the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, that's precisely what you have. The danger when you get to the temple is it is a new, as I said, it's the sort of promise of a new world being built, a new reality that was the goal to represent a new Eden. However, the danger there with that new sort of spatial reality, it's also a new political reality. You leave the place of being formed in the wilderness through this area of death and uncertainty where all you have is Yahweh to provide for you and his glory dwelling in your midst through this tabernacle, through this tent. Now you have a kingdom and all the political and sort of geopolitical downsides that brings, all the maneuvering that has to happen, all the dangers that come with a massive bureaucracy. Now you've got always there a temptation with any new shift in, like it's the creation of something new, and anytime you have that, you have to say, what are the dangers of this, right? And with the temple, you certainly get that. One of the best places to see that, and we got to skip over lots of other things we could talk about, as I said, is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is probably the main prophet identified with the temple. Isaiah is a court prophet, so he's familiar with the temple. He gets to see a temple vision in chapter 6 of Isaiah, the very famous call of Isaiah. He, in a vision, goes into the temple, the cosmic temple, and you have that whole scene. I wish we had time to talk about that. It's fascinating. But Jeremiah is actually sort of the most directly told, go to the temple and give this message. So this unfolds in chapter 7. There's many other places in Jeremiah, but this is sort of the central temple sermon Jeremiah gives. And it illustrates very well the risk that all the way back to Solomon was already hinted at. And by Jeremiah's day, you see the risk they didn't pay attention. And here's what has happened. Here's in Jeremiah's words what has happened. Has this house, Yahweh's words through Jeremiah, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. Go now to my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel. And now, because you have done all these things, declares the Lord. And when I spoke to you persistently, you did not listen, and when I called you, you did not answer. Therefore I will do to the house that is called by my name, and in which you trust, and to the place that I gave to you and your fathers as I did to Shiloh. And I will cast you out of my sight as I cast out all your kinsmen, all the offspring of Ephraim. In short, the people and the leadership, especially of Jerusalem and the temple, had come to view this thing as so glorious, not wrongly, but they had come to view it in such a way that they thought it was inviolable. They thought as long as we have this building and Yahweh is housed in it, we cannot be defeated. And that led to them living in a way that did not take the sanctity of the temple seriously. They didn't treat it as holy, right? The defilement grows and grows. Remember we talked about the sort of way that impurity is attracted to the tabernacle? It just builds up and builds up. It's like these contagious defilements just keep finding their way to the temple and further defiling the space. In addition to which they are defiling the land itself by shedding innocent blood. Their injustice, their idolatry, their defilement essentially bring God to the point where he just says, go tell them what's going to happen. This is not going to be protected the way you think. You are not impregnable. The city, the temple, and all of you leaders who allowed this to happen will all be destroyed. That's Jeremiah's message in a nutshell. For which, preaching, he is accused of being unpatriotic, right? This is like a nationalist agenda. And Jeremiah's like, guys, if we're not loyal to the covenant, why would Yahweh remain in our midst. We know how this is supposed to work. And they just accuse him of being disloyal to the nation, of not, being like too pro-Babylon. And essentially, the kings of Judah are able to accumulate enough prophets that tell them what they want to hear, and in keeping with their political desires, that Jeremiah is just ostracized as an outsider, essentially, and not listened to. And, if you know anything about Jeremiah, this leads him to severe, I think what we would talk about is pretty severe depression. And like, he wants out of this gig. He didn't like this job very much at all. I don't really blame him. But that's like, the story of Jeremiah is very rich with this kind of, it's a very sad story in this regard. But this is a good sort of embodiment of it in a short version. This, though, would lead to them, once his glory departs the temple, there's nothing protecting it. This is always the mistake that was made. Or even in like Samuel, when they're running around, they're carrying the ark around, and they go to one place and they get victory, and it's like, oh, we got this ark, man. They think it's like Indiana Jones, like just because the ark is there, power sprays out and kills everybody. It's like, no, it's only Yahweh's presence that the ark represented that gives you victory. And that message it was always apparently easy to miss, right? It wasn't about the power in the place. It was about Yahweh's presence, which sanctified both place and people. And if you don't take that sanctity seriously, he just leaves and you're powerless. And good luck fighting your own political battles and warfare on your own. All right. So skipping many, many things, as I say, I keep saying I'd like to talk about. Let's look at how the New Testament picks up these themes. I'm going to try to stay broadly theme-based here and keep, again, that big picture in mind. The church's mission in Christ through the Spirit, going all the way back to Genesis and the Eden calling, the tabernacle, the temple, where it all went awry, and then how, when Jesus appears, do these ideas start to be reformed into something familiar but totally innovative in other ways that just, again, transform reality. When I say that, you don't think I'm some like crackpot. That seems to me literally what's happening if you read the biblical story. There's always this transformation, this death and resurrection that takes place, and the new reality, the new covenant that comes out of the existing one is like it, but also, the language I always like to use is also elevates and expands it in ways that are brand new. This maybe isn't helpful if you like to identify with one sort of theology or another, which is like dispensational theology tends to emphasize all these separate eras of history, and the way things operate in any given epoch of time are this way and basically only this way, and then it gives way to another thing that's not recognizable or discontinuous with that. And then like covenant theologians like to see that there's just one basic story from beginning to end, and it's all the same thing. And I'm like, I don't think either of those are exactly wrong, but I don't think they're right. So when I say things like that this reality is familiar, but also transforms reality in a new way, I'm being pretty precise there, because I don't want it to sound like there's one thing that stops and then another thing just starts a new thing that's different or opposite, or right. It's not a good versus bad, as I've said before, when you talk about old versus new, and nor is it, however, just one one totally ambiguous story with no distinctions. There are distinctions along the way, but you got to dig them out. So if that places me too much on the covenant side for dispensationalists or too much on the dispensational side for covenant theologians, sorry, I don't know what to tell you. We can talk about it in great depth probably, but just a disclaimer there. Yes, Paul.
Even Hacking calls it a change of condition.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so conditions changing is part of it. Yeah. But I hesitate to say, when you go from this one to a new one, there are no conditions. No, there are still conditions, right? So sometimes I think like Protestant evangelicals tend to talk about new covenant realities as if all these were before were the burdensome condition-based rules, and now we go into grace, which means no conditions. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that's what you're saying, or I know David Hawking a little bit going way back, but you understand the difference. Like there's a transformation of all sorts of things, but that doesn't mean this one that replaces that one is right. It doesn't unconditionally just erase everything that came before, something like that. In any case,
it's in Philippians 2:5, how it's done, you know. In Philippians 2:5.
You got it?
Yeah.
Because I don't have it open here.
Your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let
Yeah.
mine be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, thought it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men.
Yeah. So I would argue that picks up all the language from these old covenant realities and brings them fully to the maturity in Christ. But, how we describe all this is, it's not always easy to describe it. There's not one exact way to describe it. I mentioned Philippians a couple times, but okay, tonight I'm going to come at this mainly, at least as we get to the Gospels, through John's Gospel. John's Gospel is probably the most obviously temple-oriented. The other Gospels I'll mention, they're doing something also with temple theology, if you want to say, but John's is pretty much the most obvious about it. Starting right at the get-go, right at almost the introduction of his Gospel, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Most of you have heard this explained before, and I've just changed the translation to reflect the reality. In the Greek, it actually says this pretty directly. Kataskene. Skene is almost just a transliteration from Shekhinah, right? Or sorry, the Mishkan is the tabernacle, from the verb shachan, to dwell. It's a rabbinic term, actually. Jews started to be called the glory cloud in the wilderness, the Shekhinah, the Shekinah. That's just a derivative of dwelling place. So the glory that dwelt with Israel came to be known by the dwelling place, the Shekhinah. John's language just sort of picks that all up, and in the Greek form, it's just skene. So it sounds similar, actually. This is just a sort of a Hebrew loan word, I think. But the Word became flesh and mishkan, right? Shachan among us, tabernacled among us, and we have seen His glory, right? The Shekhinah is in Him, or it is Him, right? Say it however you want. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John, interestingly, starts his gospel with both tabernacle themes and creation themes. He just joins them together, right? The light in the darkness, etc. That's all creation. But creation and tabernacle, remember, are just microcosms of one another. Microcosm, macrocosm. On to John chapter 2. And this is interesting and important. Jesus goes during Passover to the temple. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." He identifies it as his Father's house. He doesn't say the temple is a place that no longer has importance, right? If it's his Father's house, you can bet he wants it to be honored, right? He only cares about this because he thinks the temple should be honored. But what they're doing there becomes the problem, right? Not treating it with the proper sanctity. His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." That's from the Psalms. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. This is remarkable. This is what we call the second temple, right? Built after the exile and the return to the land. Ezra, Nehemiah, the prophet Haggai, Zechariah prophesy about this pretty directly. It's about the rebuilding of the temple. Zechariah and Nehemiah give a sort of historical perspective on what happens and how this is done. What they build, what they produce under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Ezra and others becomes this, it's really a pretty sad state of affairs when they get done. Like, it's just this little building that's, yay, we have a temple, but a lot of them are like, this is miserable. We remember the one, right? There are people living in the rebuilt second temple that remember Solomon's temple, and they're crying because this is no good. This just does not match the glory of the first temple. But it was the promise that God gave that I will rebuild. I will bring you back and you will rebuild. So it was this sort of new creation again that was cause for rejoicing. Again, it's a little bit ambiguous. What are we supposed to think about this? In the meantime, starting in the, 20, 30 years before Jesus, King Herod massively renovates, essentially to the point where he's just a brand new building almost. Like, we call it a renovation. Essentially, he makes such a massive overhaul to this existing temple that it becomes known as Herod's temple. We call this the second temple, but this is the temple that Jesus is talking about here. However, not only does he come into the temple precinct and act like Jeremiah, right? He is replaying the Jeremiah prophetic role here. He is another Jeremiah coming up in the temple, right at the temple leadership, and saying, "You have made this." He quotes Jeremiah. "You have made this a robber's den." So he comes and calls out the corruption of the temple as another Jeremiah. But he doesn't stop there. When they sort of question him and challenge him, he says, "Oh, you know what? I'll show you. By what authority am I going to... You want to see some authority? Like, you want to see documentation for what authority I have to do this? Tear the temple down, in 3 days I'll build it back up." And then everyone realizes this is nonsense. What? That's not how this... That's not possible, obviously. Right? And he obviously didn't mean it to be literally tear down this temple, although his statement and then more comments that he will make throughout his ministry will indicate he does keep warning this temple will be destroyed. The second temple, the temple of Herod, will be destroyed. But that's only the secondary reference here. The primary reference is obviously speaking of his own body, right? John just tells you that and he editorializes it. Jesus, in answering them, just walks on the scene and he starts to hint that as Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple, so Rome will destroy the second temple. You better get used to not having it. For him, it is a judgment and therefore a national catastrophe for Israel. But theologically, this is not a problem for Jesus. Why? Because he just recasts himself as the new temple. Are you with me? Does anybody follow how shocking this is? This is one of the reasons he was thought of as a crackpot and a nutcase and was rejected by many, in fact, almost all the leadership and many of the people. He just sounds crazy. However, he's picking up ideas that were not unknown. As we keep going, you start to see more of this. He is now casting himself as the dwelling place of God on earth among humanity, which was always the purpose of the tabernacle. So the function and purpose of the tabernacle, which carries into the temple and transfers there, is precisely this. So that shouldn't be shocking. Why can't God's glory reside among humanity in a moving physical temple? Well, that's what we've always thought, right? That's the beginning of all this. And he's just in some way saying the same thing, but obviously in another way, he's going way beyond what anybody expected of this reality. So, and this will build throughout John's gospel, and the other gospels, again, pick up ideas like this. So the end of Mark's gospel, started in chapter 14, we'll get to chapter 15 in a minute. This is at his trial. Some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "Yeah, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another one not made with hands. Which is true, right? That is what he said, but what are they accusing him of? They're accusing him of threatening to destroy the temple, some sort of rebellion, like political rebellion, what have you, insurrection, what have you. So they're quoting him, I guess, accurately, but this is what we'd say accurately, but out of context, right? It's interesting. There's a lot of Christian interpretation about things like this and Jesus' relationship to the temple that reads it as if when he makes statements like this, when in the Olivet Discourse, for example, he tells his disciples, not one stone will be left upon another. These will all be thrown down. When he promises and predicts the destruction of the temple, that he is doing so because he is going to be the one to destroy it, because since his sacrifice and his ministry and resurrection make him the new temple, that he is like intentionally going to be the one to destroy the old temple because it's not necessary anymore. And I think that overreads it. I'm not sure that I'm entirely right about this. Obviously, there's some aspect of he replaces the temple. He is the new temple. But I think some of that reads Jesus as a little bit too antagonistic to the temple itself. And I don't see any real reason to believe that he is. I think if you read him straightforwardly, he only cares to warn about the destruction of the temple because he wants it to be honored. He thinks it is a holy place where God should dwell, and it should be treated that way. His problem is that it's not treated that way. Not that it should go away because he's here. I think he could live, and his apostles in the book of Acts do live contemporaneously with the temple standing, and they participate in its worship, apparently totally legitimately, considering it totally legitimate, while they themselves, as we'll talk about, are the new temple reality, living out Jesus' life on earth as the temple. So in any case, that's a little bit of a sidebar, but it's interesting. To read Jesus as wanting the destruction of the temple is to sort of agree with the false witnesses here, which is like, yeah, he said he would destroy this temple, that jerk, right? They accuse Paul of similar stuff. He said he would destroy the customs handed down to us through Moses and destroy the temple. It's like, Paul worships at the temple. So that's a little bit nuanced. Sorry to get into too much of it, but just be aware. I wouldn't automatically read Jesus's negative warnings about what's going to happen to the temple as if he desires its destruction. He's the one walking into Jerusalem crying over what's going to happen. So I somehow doubt that it's that straightforward for him. But in any case, next chapter, Mark 15, and this is at the crucifixion. Jesus uttered a loud cry, breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood facing him saw that this was the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So there's a lot here, but obviously for our purposes, it's verse 38 that is the most impactful. And all three Gospels, I think, all three synoptic Gospels include this detail. That's curious. You got to assume there's some importance to it. Not just that it's included at all, but that all three Gospel writers of the synoptics include it. That the curtain in the temple, which remember, this is not the tabernacle. This is a huge structure, and this is a massive curtain, that it's torn into top to bottom. Remember, in the symbolism, I don't know how much of this I actually explained in the last few weeks, but in the symbolism, this curtain with the cherubim embroidered on it was sort of the representation of the heavens itself. So if you think of Moses going up to Mount Sinai, and the elders look up when they get sort of partway up, and they see the sort of tile like sapphire or something. It's like a glass, it's like a sort of, transparent glass barrier. It is like the sky, or the rakia in Genesis 1, the heavens, or what we call the firmament, right? And it depends on your translation, the expanse. The curtain in the temple seems to represent that, right? It has angelic figures embroidered on there. It's meant to represent the heavens, which separate God's realm from ours. The idea that the curtain is then just going to be torn in two. Remember our holiness, what happens when the high priest goes in there? The only thing separating humanity from the glory fire of the Shekinah is this curtain. On the Day of Atonement, that curtain is opened because the high priest has to go in there, but he's very deliberate about making sure incense creates a cloud of smoke, because that smoke will then do the job that the curtain was doing, which is some sort of protective veil, screen, between the glory and the human who could be at risk of death because you're in the presence of God's, glory power or whatever. The idea that the temple curtain would just be ripped apart, and the symbolism of that being the heavens ripped apart, is picking up again this idea of the prophets. Isaiah talks about this. I don't have a verse for you, but that you would rend the heavens and come down, right? The idea of, again, restoration, renewal, new creation requires God to break into the earthly realm by ripping the heavens apart and coming through the veil to be where we are, right? Isaiah's famous Emmanuel, God who is with us, is what we need, right? This is all rolling along in the same sort of cognitive set of ideas. The idea that the temple is torn in two seems to indicate, I've never quite settled whether there's one way to read the implications of this. The obvious one is that humanity seems no longer to be separated from God in the same way that they were in the temple and the tabernacle. This opens access. That's what Hebrews says, or seems to say, right? Hebrews 10. We quoted this a couple of weeks ago, so I won't recite it all here. But by the new and living way, in verse 20, that he opened for us through the curtain, that is through his flesh, through Jesus' death, we get new access to God's presence in the heavenly throne room. That seems to fit with what's happening on the cross when the curtain is torn. But another reality there is, remember what the curtain was doing in the way I was telling it. It's protecting the people from the glory that was danger, the holiness charged glory of God's presence that was dangerous to them. It seems like it's totally possible at the death of Jesus and the tearing of the curtain that it's not just that we can now go where he is, but that God's Shekinah, God's glory presence would be on the loose. It's just turned loose, right? Does that jive with anybody, or have you thought about that before? It seems to me it could be both and. We can go now where he is, but also the implications are we don't need this veil anymore to protect humanity from God's presence. Jesus makes it possible by the Spirit that he can just, again, be ambulatory, mobilized, go walk around among them and not threaten them in the same way. And you see this in Jesus' own ministry, in his own life, in his own body. He walks around as the Shekinah, as the tabernacling glory of God among us, which obviously means he is holy. But when he, for instance, makes contact, physical contact with someone who is defiled, blood defilement in the case of the woman, right, with some sort of genital flow, a leper, right, someone with a skin disease. He just goes around touching these people pretty obviously on purpose. And he does not contract defilement and cause death right away. In fact, it's the opposite. The polarity reverses, if I read this right. So in the tabernacle system, that shouldn't have worked. When defilement contacts holiness, what happens? Death, usually by fire, but death nonetheless, like Nadav and Avihu. Anything happens where those two mix, it's bad news for the one bringing the defilement. In Jesus' case, he walks around and his holiness infuses life and purges defilement. It's unbelievable. Now you get to the preaching section of tonight. Is anybody following me here? It shouldn't work.
Isn't that too, it's grace for everybody, even those who don't believe in one respect, right?
Yes, he seems to go out of his way to have contact with such people that would be thought to be defiling. And he thinks that's the way to do this. It's partly, again, why he's not very well liked by the religious establishment. That's a good way to get yourself defiled by those defiled people. And he's like, yeah, so what? I'm not worried about that. Watch this. And he just passes life into everyone instead of bringing death because they're defiled. It's really an astonishing reality. And I think all of this, and this is just a glimpse of the sort of imagery and the symbolism and the sort of life-giving, Eden-spreading reality that was represented in the tabernacle. And now Jesus is just bringing it to life in real vivid examples that take, again, the familiar terminology and sort of ideas of the Levitical system and then just do things with it that shouldn't quite work the way that they do, but for him they do. So it's really marvelous. Let's keep going. 1 Peter here. Checking our clock. Okay. As you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So this is one of my favorite examples of how in the New Testament, the apostles view Jesus as the new temple, and then by virtue of their identification with him, or in him, is the language Paul always uses, they become then, you could say, part of the temple, but they also just are the temple, right? And notice Peter's, what he's doing here. Just as, remember David was promised that through your son, I will build a house, right? The Davidic dynasty was promised through Solomon. Jesus is the greater than Solomon, who's also the greater than the temple. He is the son of David, right? That promise turns out to be, in its fullest expression, about Jesus, or it lands on Jesus, and he fills it up. He is the son of David that builds the house for David. You follow? Peter seems to be aware of this, and I think he may be sort of riffing on it. But in Peter's, one of the things he seems to have taken from that Davidic covenant promise is that you are stones in the temple. You, if you're a believer in Jesus, if you're identified with him. But can anyone explain to me what the heck a living stone is? Right? By definition, stones are the one thing, like the first example that comes to mind is, how do you define something that's living versus not living? Well, animate. If it's animate, meaning it moves, anything moving, you assume has life in it somehow.
It's almost like the stones will cry out.
Yes. If you had to think of a thing that definitely doesn't ever move in the realm of creation, like the first thing that comes to my mind is a stone. Peter's like, yeah, no, that's not how this works. Stones obviously are living if they are the living stones, right? So the stones become people. The people are what build the temple. You get the imagery here. It works on just the way it seems to have been told to David it was going to work. Yes?
So, the third temple, will it be built once we're raptured? Because right now we're living stones. We're the living temple that Jesus is here on this earth. So then once we're raptured, then they have to make a third temple because there's nothing to hold God?
I have to defer the whole question of whether another temple will be built, say, in Jerusalem. That's just a bigger conversation that I don't have a good answer for right now. Could it be? Yes. Does it need to be? I don't think so. A lot of this gets to how you identify what Ezekiel is doing, right, in his vision of the temple, and whether that needs to be a physical temple built on earth at some point in our future. And that's not at all clear to me. It's possible, except Ezekiel's language is first of all, it's just far too big to fit in Jerusalem. There would have to be a massive sort of topographical upheaval for it to even work, which doesn't mean it couldn't. But Ezekiel's language seems mostly to be picked up in the New Testament by this kind of stuff. I hate to say it's just metaphor, because I don't think there is such a thing as just metaphor. I think these are real realities. It is a real temple Peter is describing. It's just not a physical one made of stones. Could another physical temple be built made of stones and lumber in Jerusalem? Sure, for some purpose, but I can't say for sure that it will, or certainly not when it will. That's just beyond my pay grade. But for the theology of the tabernacle and for what the temple was teaching all along, I think Peter's expression here, or as you go to look at Ephesians, what Paul does with all this, is much more useful for us to just pick up and say, what do we do with this in our lives? All right? Whether something will be built in Jerusalem in some future day or not really relevant to how we function as a church body. This stuff is. So I'll have to leave that there because it's just a little, simply because the answer is I don't really know, or I don't have a definitive position. It's interesting to talk about, but that's an in-depth discussion. To even get to what might be a more clear position is a lot of discussion that I don't think I could do, and I definitely don't have time to do. But okay, let's close. Paul uses this language actually all the time, or several places. One of the main ones is Ephesians, chapter 2, talking about, in particular, how Gentile believers have joined with Israel, right, in their covenant community, right? God has formed this new humanity out of Jew and Gentile together, and he says, fellow citizens with the saints, members of the household of God. Remember that household language? It's fluid between house and household. So he's doing that. So the house of God, or the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah, Jesus himself, being the cornerstone, same idea as Peter. This comes from Psalm 118. This comes from Isaiah. In whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. This is, again, the apostles think of this as a thing that's ongoing in their lifetime. It's a temple that's building, but it's growing as it keeps getting added to. Again, not normally how it works with a physical temple, but in Christ these realities are, again, transformed into something new. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. So God dwells on earth now in this reality, in and through his Spirit among his people. Let's keep moving. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, do you not know that you all, these are plural here, which I keep, you always have to watch out for where you think a verse is talking about you, but it's really talking about y'all. We don't reflect that in Bible translations, but there really should be an upgrade in the way we translate a lot of these New Testament terms to pick up the plural in language that the old King James actually did it pretty well for all of its flaws. It did this pretty well with the, ye's and thou's, and those all had actual useful utility for this kind of stuff. But do y'all not know that y'all are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. And notice Paul's emphasis here, and this is because the Corinthian church had a particular problem with this. They had a lot of division, a lot of pride, a lot of tolerance of sin at work in their city, in their congregation, in their gatherings, in their church. And so Paul starts to use the temple language in 1 Corinthians, precisely as an antidote to that type of thing. They are not treating the church of God with the proper sanctity, right? With the proper regard for the holiness of God's house that they should have. So he's picking up, again, ideas of Levitical holiness and purity, and saying this is what's appropriate for you who house God's glory in your life, in your midst, right? How do you then treat each other in the way that you're treating each other? How do you allow false teaching and immorality to just run wild in the church and not deal with it? This is a very important point that Paul makes. He goes on to actually talk about within the church how this gets more individualized. You believers, anyone who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you? And this is individual. Your body, you, believer, is also a temple of the Holy Spirit. God's glory dwells in you. That makes you holy remember as we talked about, that means he has claimed ownership of you for his purposes in service to him. He dwells in you, not for no reason, right? Because he expects that you will keep this place clean. You will honor the status he's given you as a holy place, as walking sacred space, if you will, and that you won't defile it with things that introduce God's holiness to this type of corruption, right? Get in more into this down the line in 1 Corinthians, but this is part of why at the Lord's Supper, when he challenges them for what they're doing at the Lord's Supper, he says, like, a lot of you are dying, or some of you have died. What? Like, yeah, you're not properly treating God's holy house as it should be treated. You're defiling it. So, defilement comes into contact with holiness. Watch out. That's a paraphrase, but something like that. 2 Corinthians, similar warnings, caveats. What agreement has the temple of God with idols? Corinth also had a problem with meals, participating in meals with idol meat and things like this he addresses in 1 Corinthians. It's also still apparently a problem in 2 Corinthians, but he's getting at them for some of these false teachers, people that are subverting Paul's ministry and authority, but also people just introducing, again, defiling teaching and actions into the church. And he says, you got to stop participating and being unequally yoked with these either unbelievers or believers that have fallen away and are compromising the church so badly now that because we are the temple of the living God, you are filling it with idols, right? You're bringing idols into it. And this is just, this mix can't happen. This gets to what are the continuities between the old and the new? What temple realities also exist in the church? Well, this certainly, it doesn't mean the standards go away for purity. Do some of them change? Yeah, we're not as worried about bodily emissions in the church as ancient Israel would have been, right? But looking at 2 Corinthians 7, verse 1, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, and bring holiness to completion in the fear of God. So fearing God, an attendance on purity in our lives, that's all still part of those are still qualifications for having him dwell in our midst. It's not like there are no more standards and he'll just put up with anything and everything. Not at all the case. In some cases, the standards are elevated from what they had to guard against in the tabernacle system. I already referenced Hebrews. I just want to skip ahead down to verse 15, actually, here, for time's sake. Just to see one more thing. The church lives out the reality of the temple and the tabernacle ethically. That's what Paul was just covering. That's what Peter was talking about in part. Keep away from, let's say, political alignments or fellowship commitments that defile God's temple. But those are ethical and socio-political realities that the church as a temple embodies and has to be careful of. But look with me, I want to show you just quickly what Hebrews does, and then we could carry this to Revelation, although I doubt we'll have time. Through Christ, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. So again, directly sacrificial language from Leviticus. On the altar, that would be an animal. In Hebrews, the sacrifice is Jesus. He's already been talking about this. Jesus sacrificed on the cross is the altar that sends the offering up to God to be accepted on our behalf, or we're accepted, right, by his sacrifice. But then Hebrews talks about us continually offering up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. And do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. And you notice what he's done here. This is ethical instruction, and he says, again, as Paul and Peter, that the church embodies the temple reality by their ethic. But he also puts forward the idea that the church embodies and sort of lives out and replays the operation of the temple and the tabernacle liturgically in our worship, in our speech, when we gather for worship, in word and in song and in prayer. These things also apparently are counted as sacrifices. They ascend to God as a sort of thanksgiving offering, right? This is what I think he means by sacrifice of praise. This would correspond roughly to the peace offering, I suppose. Romans 12, right? Talk about your body, right? It's a burnt offering. It's the whole offering. It's the ascension offering, right? These things are embodied in the church in ways that, yes, are careful what you do, but also these ritual and liturgical ways that we practice the reality of heaven when we get together. I don't think we should really just view them as, well, we're imagining ourselves as entering into the heavenly throne room. I really think the New Testament authors believe that this life of this liturgical and ritual participation is a participation in the heavenly temple, as in real time, as we're doing it. It is the way, and you see this in Revelation. We won't get time to talk about it tonight. But this is what a lot of Revelation is about. That most of Revelation is a heavenly temple scene. It's set in the throne room in the cosmic throne room, where God rules the universe from among his divine council, from the operational control center, if you will. Right? That's what temples were in the ancient world. Much of Revelation is showing a heavenly worship service, if you will. This ritual and liturgy is happening. So there's incense burning, the cloud fills with smoke. There's angels blowing trumpets like a Levitical choir. There's people singing songs, and they have their appropriate times when they sing this song, and then they all bow down, and then they get up and they sing another song. It is a liturgical service of worship in the heavenly temple. Why is John shown a vision of that? Because the church that is suffering martyrdom, persecution and martyrdom in the first century, in John's day, or is about to, when he's given this vision, shortly they will suffer greatly. They need to know, like Ezekiel needed to be encouraged, that God is still ruling, just not from the temple you can see. He's ruling from the cosmic throne room, the heavenly temple. But what happens up there, in part, causes the events that happen down here to the church on earth, and in part, respond to what happens in the church on earth. You follow me? So like the souls John sees in chapter 5, I believe, under the altar in Revelation, are appealing to God. They are martyred believers, and they're saying, how long until you avenge our blood on the earth? And then much of what happens in the ensuing chapters of Revelation is to answer that prayer. Right? So God will pour out these things on the earth, in part because that incense, which is the prayers of the saints, rose up to his presence, and he decided, I will respond. There is an interplay, in other words, a participatory aspect to how the church on earth in worship engages heavenly realities, and God therefore responds to answer those prayers. Not always the way that they would want, because one of the things he tells them is, well, a lot more of you have to be killed before the final justice comes. But he hears the prayers. They get there. And angels are delivering stuff, right? They're burning incense. And it is a whole temple liturgical worship service, but it's not imaginary. It seems to be shown to John to make them realize all that you're going through. Not only should you keep going and just hang on, But what you do, your testimony, your witness, your liturgical life as a church, your testimony, your faithfulness to Christ, it unlocks heavenly answers. And God responds by changing the world. Right? And you can argue a lot of this is what's going on in Acts or in the first century or in the first couple centuries. And I'm totally open to the idea that it still has a future reality, but I also think it's probably got an ongoing reality. Every week we gather and we worship and we sing and we read and we think, in some sense, I believe, we just get stuck thinking that, well, this is nice to pretend ourselves into the heavenly realm. And I don't think that's the right way to view it. I think it's more likely that if we did it, as Hebrews is talking about, as Revelation sort of gives us the picture, and all the Psalms talk about, we would really see that earthly realities, political realities, church problems could and would be transformed by heavenly intervention, by God sending down answers, right? And what we would call spiritual warfare. That's what I think a lot of Revelation's about, but it's directly tied to the way the temple and the tabernacle before it were designed to operate. Again, this ritual enactment that brings us back into God's presence, that relives Eden and turns the Eden reality loose on all creation. That's our job, and that's our role. And the temple's supposed to be our paradigm for this. And in Jesus, we have an elevated version of it, a cosmic version of it that we currently now should be participating in. It's a question of how seriously do we take that as a reality? In any case, let's close there. Lord, thank you for the time, for your word.